Sunday, 28 July, 1861. My God, never let me forget the experiences of the past days, so that when I am old enough to start a war, I will not think my duty heroic or glorious. The men who start wars ought to be shot to let the rest of us live, but more often is the case when the devils are never fired upon. We left Washington the day after we arrived, having had scant time to rest after our march from Camp Carradine. It was hotter that day than it had been the day we entered the military. We woke up soggy and only became more drenched as the day wore on. It had been a week and a half since I had bathed, longer since most of the men of our regiment had done so. We were a veritable wall of stench and grime. We marched about 10 miles west before we set up camp just outside of Annandale. On the 17th we encountered the Confederates at Fairfax Courthouse. They fled before us, and our troops paraded through the streets to the cacophony of dozens of regimental bands playing different tunes at the same time. We spent the night of the 17th and the 18th bivouacked outside the town, cooking rations and, in Aubrey's case, belittling the Southern man with lewd comments, present company excepted, of course. We bivouacked on the bluffs west of Centerville on the 19th and 20th, visited constantly by well-wishing civilians from miles around the town. The girls all seemed to have their finest frocks packed away in the trunks on the back of their carriages or in hotel rooms, as they all expected to dance after the Confederates had been beaten down. They filled the camp with the dust from their footsteps and congested the thoroughfares unbearably, but they also brought picnic lunches for those of us lucky enough to find favor with them. Fried chicken, potatoes, and lemonade were a welcome change from salt pork and hardtack. Aubrey found a girl who thought so much of him that she gave him a flower from her bonnet to fix in his own hat-band, and he was quite proud of his accomplishment until he happened upon several fellows with sprigs of the same type of bloom on their hats. A calm pervaded the bivouac late on the 20th, when we finally received confirmation that we were to march against the enemy the next day. I went to fill my canteen 3 times before I was satisfied that it could hold no more water. Our haversacks were filled with enough rations for 3 days, though I had trouble keeping some of the men from eating them all at once. In addition to the hardtack, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and salt in my haversack, I also had 3 small boiled potatoes in my pockets from a girl whose name I cannot for the life of me remember, who said I reminded her of a figure out of an advertisement she had seen years ago for what had since become her favorite novel, Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. That the hero of the novel was a coward and ultimately perished did not strike her as an insulting or ominous parallel with myself, so I did not take it as such, guessing she had never actually read the book, but only espoused its cause in an outdated attempt to appear fashionable. I thanked her, and said I should try to live up to the worthy fellow's example, at which she smiled and went on to the next man. As far as I know, Aubrey did not sleep at all that night, for he was sitting in the same position when I finally fell asleep around midnight, and when we were roused without reveille long before dawn. He wouldn't show me what he had been reading by the firelight, but I did see him cross himself a couple of times when he thought I wasn't looking. I don't know what he thought I'd say about it. I've never had a problem with his religion. Indeed, I'm relieved he prays. We were supposed to be ready to move out at 2:30, but it was closer to 5 when we finally started moving. Our division was behind Tyler's and Hunter's, and our regiment was in the middle brigade, necessitating our ingestion of the dust kicked up by the thousands of men in front of us. I got a rather nasty bruise on my leg from stumbling in the dark. Until that march, I had no idea men could move so slowly. We'd been moving downhill for half an hour before I realized the grade. Occasional long minutes of complete standstill did nothing to diminish the chagrin of our company. Aubrey was under the impression that we were going to wait the rebels to death, and most of the men agreed with him. These mutterings were forgotten when daylight brought sight of blackberries growing thick on the sides of the road. Captain Hudson laughed when he saw the men break formation to raid the bushes, and told me to get him a handful too. We finally turned off the road leading to Bull Run several hours behind schedule, I'm sure. Somewhere between 5:30 and 6, we heard the first cannon shots. The ranks seemed to jump in unison, and my heart beat 1,000 times faster than before. The cannons were silent for some time afterward, as the Confederate guns did not return fire. Some of us began speculating that the enemy may not even be at Sudley's Ford on Bull Run. Wouldn't it be something if they were headed to Blackburn's Ford, where only a couple of brigades were left in reserve? General McDowell would catch it then. The firing resumed, however, with the sound of muskets resonating through the field like firecrackers under a tin can. The cannons boomed again and again, like the fancy skyrockets that Father bought for the town one year to celebrate Independence Day. Still, our division remained stationary. Captain Hudson allowed us to sit in the grass alongside the road to rest our swollen feet. We might have felt like a bunch of school children at a Sunday picnic, if not for our weariness and the noise in the distance. The gentry, who had been traveling alongside the army, even joined us on their blankets. A few moments later, a group of people ran toward us, dressed in their Sunday best. The women were crying and clutching their children close, while their husbands grouped around Captain Hudson and questioned him in near hysterical shouts. Apparently they had been about to begin worship, when the firing started a few 100 yards away. They must have thought the wrath of judgment was upon them. We stayed in our position most of the remainder of the day. At around 3, Captain Hudson learned that we were being held in reserve, but were not forgotten. Aubrey, out of danger, and free to disregard his previous religious fervor, cursed everything from the heat and dust to the sheep whose wool he was wearing. I had just glanced at and put away Father's watch when our division was called up. Captain Hudson was as confused as the rest of us at the order, but led us to our place nonetheless. My God, I don't want to write this, but I must. The sun was blinding in the west, and seemed to me redder than usual. We moved double quick toward where the firing had been loudest since the lull of around noon. We had only a few 100 yards to go before we started stepping around fallen comrades. Though I was running, I could still see their faces. God help me, I can't stop seeing them. The sun had caused their skin to darken and bloat. Each one looked like a dead fat Negro. I couldn't help seeing Father's James in all their faces. Their blood had stained the grass red, and in places it pooled and glistened in the sunlight like the great scarlet beads on Aubrey's rosary. We finally came to the top of a rise, overlooking the battlefield below. I can't describe how horrible it was. Hundreds of bodies lay thick between us and a line of Confederates. Only one other time have I felt as I did then. I'd fallen in the lake on one of Father's fishing trips and gotten tangled in the reeds. I couldn't take a breath, but it was the one thing in the world I wanted most. Aubrey crossed himself in view of us all. The bugle call to fix bayonets sounded. My voice cracked and my hands shook as I drew my sword and called the order to my platoon. An ungodly yell went through the Confederate ranks. I thought the devil had called the charge on heaven as the rebels marched toward us with their guns held out like spears. I thought of nothing as the first of their ranks fired into our front line. They kept coming, mercilessly firing at us even as they saw our men fall. Jack Baker fell right in front of me with part of his cheek blown away. I put my sword away and picked up his gun, pulling his powder and cartridge box away from him. I fumbled loading my powder, my hands were shaking so. I couldn't see the enemy any longer. The smoke and powder burned my eyes like the water had the day I almost drowned. I couldn't breathe and was struggling to surface above the foggy white hell before me. I stopped bothering to load the gun, but fixed the bayonet and struck out in front of me, hoping to pierce and stop anything that was there. I stabbed like a madman, finding nothing but air until the bayonet fixed itself in something solid. I couldn't pull it out of whatever it was, but brought that something out of the smoke when I pulled back on the gun. A man came with it. His eyes were wide and staring at me like I'd surprised him with the news that everyone he knew had just been killed. He was like that for only a few seconds before he slumped down with my bayonet sticking out the other side of his chest. When he was on the ground, I put my foot on him and yanked the bayonet out. I stared at it a moment, watching the blood running out from the grooves to the ground. Aubrey pulled on my jacket from behind and held me as he and the rest of the regiment ran from the invisible enemy. We were tripping over each other and dead men, but still the rebels came after us. I didn't look back until we reached Centerville. On the march back to Washington, Captain Hudson had me give the orders, as he had lost his own voice commanding during the battle. I called rote step, and kept my head as high as possible at the front of the column. I was shaking all over the whole way back, but most of the others were as well, so I don't think anyone noticed. Mercifully, it started to rain that night, so my tears could go unnoticed as well.